Welcome pre-calculus students. If you're watching this video, you're either checking your evens because they are not in the back of the book, so feel free to fast forward to the problems that you need to check, or maybe you were looking for certain problems that you did check in the back of the book, the odds, and you did not get right. So use this video however it helps you. I'm going to be working out, well actually the assignment is right here in front of you on the screen, page 19, numbers 35 to 46, so feel free to fast forward, rewind, do whatever you need to do to find the problems that you have questions on. Okay, let's start with number 35. We are factoring. Okay, number 35, we are factoring. Now step one is always pull out or factor out what's common. There is no number that we know that goes into 2, 9, and 56 evenly. Notice there's also not the variable n in every term, so there's nothing common we can factor out. All right. Next, what we want to do is look at our trinomial and say to ourselves, do I have a lead coefficient of 1 or do I not? And obviously you do not. You have a lead coefficient of 2. So what we do is we take this number right here and we multiply it by this number right here, which would give us negative 112. Negative 112. Now we're going to list out all the factors of negative 112, and obviously that's going to be a lot of numbers. So you need to learn to be efficient with this and learn to just kind of think a little harder and not work harder. I mean, sure, we could list out 1 times 112, 1 times 112, and we could put positive times negative and negative times positive. But obviously those sets aren't going to help us. None of those are going to combine to a positive 9, okay? So you have to kind of think. I mean, 2 really doesn't help either. 2 times 56, 2 times 56, positive times a negative, negative times a positive. I mean, really, when you combine those two sets, none of them are going to give you a 9. But I thought about, as I went through the numbers, I was thinking of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I got to 7, and I kind of did it in my head, and I was thinking 7 times 16 is 112. And that would be a positive times a negative and a negative times a positive. And guess what? One of those two sets does combine or add up to a positive 9. And it's this one right here. So those are the two numbers that I want to use. So what I taught you in class today was to rewrite your middle term, positive 9n. You're going to rewrite that with two terms. You're going to put negative 7n and positive 16n. Now why did I use n? Because your middle term was an n term. So that's why we put 7n and 16n. Then bring down your negative 56. And then the last step says go ahead and factor this by grouping, and we do know how to do that. First of all, we look at just the first two terms. We don't pay attention to any of these over here. Okay, we just look at the first two terms and we pull out what's common in the first two terms. Well, nothing goes into 2 and 7 evenly, but I can pull an n out of both terms. So I'm going to write an n, put a little parentheses, n times 2n. n times 2n would give you 2n squared. And then here I'd put a negative 7 because n times negative 7 is negative 7n. Now let's come to your last two terms. Ignore these two terms over here. And now we're just going to look at these two terms. And we're going to pull out what's common in these two terms. Well, the largest number that goes into 16 and 56, yes, 2 goes into both of them and 4 goes into both of them, but 8 also goes into both of those numbers. Now, notice we do not have an n in both terms, so we're not going to pull an n out. Let's go ahead and put our parentheses. 8 times, sorry about that, there we go. 8 times 2n would be 16n, and 8 times negative 7 would be negative 56. And look, your parentheses match, and they should. So cross off your matching parentheses. We're going to write it one time, and then we're left over on the outside with n and positive 8. So n and positive 8. There we go. Number 35 done. Not too hard. Okay, number 36. Step 1 is always factor out what's common. I know of no number that goes into 3 and 7 and 20 evenly, and there's not a y in any term, so we cannot factor out any common factors. Now, we notice that we have a lead coefficient of 3, which means I'm going to take this number here and multiply it times this number here, and then write my product right over here. So 3 times negative 20 would be negative 60. And now I've got to list out all the factors of negative 60. Now that could take a while, so let's think this through. I know I'm not going to use 1 and 60 or 2 times 30 or 3 times 20. let's see, 4 times 15. Let's see, 4 times 15, 5 times 12. That might work. Let's write that down and take a look at it. 5 times 12. I'm just trying to save time, students, and not write down all of those factors of negative 60. Well, I want a negative 60, so a positive times a negative, and a negative times a positive would give me a negative 60. Now, one of these does add up to positive 7, and it's this group right here. So what I do next is, if you'll remember your notes from today, I rewrite this middle term, this 7y, as negative 5y, positive 12y, okay? And then bring down your negative 20. So what you did is you rewrote your middle term by using two different terms, okay? Now, we go ahead and factor by grouping. So I'm going to look at my first two terms right over here. I know of no number that goes into 3 and 5 evenly, but I notice both of these terms have at least one y, so I can pull one y out. And here I would put 3y because y times 3y is 3y squared. Over here I will put a negative 5 because y times negative 5 is negative 5y. Okay? Now let's look at our last two terms over here. What number could I pull out of 12 and 20, the largest number? Well, the largest number that goes into both of these is 4. Okay? So I know I can factor out a 4, and there's not a y in both terms, so I cannot factor out a y, but I can factor out a 4. So we'll put a 4 here. 4 times 3y is negative 12y, and then 4 times negative 5, correct? 4 times negative 5 is negative 20. And notice you're matching, notice your two parentheses are matching, so you write the matching parentheses one time, and you're left over with y plus 4, or y positive 4, in your other parentheses. Okay? Moving on to number 37. Okay, step 1, always pull out what's common. I know of no number that goes to 12, 11, and 2 evenly. I look for x's. There's no x in this term right here, so I cannot factor out any x's. Next, I look at my lead coefficient. It's not a 1. I wish it was. That's the easier kind, but it's not. It's a 12. So I'm going to take this number here, 12, times this number here, 2, and write the product right over here. And when I do that, I will get 24. Now we're going to list out all of the factors of 24. Now I could list them all out, 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 6 times 4, but just kind of use some common sense here. It seems like to me 3 and 8 are going to be a good fit. And I do want a positive 24, so I want a positive times a positive and a negative times a negative. Now one of these two groups will add up to a positive 11. It's going to be those two numbers right there. So remember, you bring down your first term, and then right here in place of the 11x, you're going to put two terms. You're going to put a positive 3x, and I got that from this number right here, and a positive 8x, and I got the 8 from this number over here. Why did I use an x? Because your middle term was an x term. And then bring down your positive 2. Now we factor by grouping, and we should know very well how to do that. Pull out what's common in your first two terms, What goes into 3 and 12 evenly? 3 does. And here I have two x's and one x, so I can pull one x out. So I'm left over with, let's see, 3x times 4x would give me 12x squared, okay? And 3x times 1 would give me 3x. All right, now let's look at our last two terms. They don't have an x in both terms, but what number goes into 2 and 8 evenly? Well, 2 does, so I'm going to factor out a 2. And let's see, 2 times 4x would give me 8x, correct? And then 2 times positive 1, 2 times 1 would give me a 2. And notice your parentheses do match, so you're going to write those matching parentheses one time, and you're left over in the other parentheses with 3x plus 2. 3x plus 2. Okay, that's number 37. Moving on to number 38. Now, we're going to continue using these same steps over and over and over. You're going to get so tired of hearing them, but it's very important that we practice. Step 1 is factor out the common factor. I know of no number that goes into 6 and 7 and 20 evenly, and notice every term does not have an x, so there's nothing we can factor out. Next, I look at my lead coefficient and I say to myself, okay, self, do I have a lead coefficient of 1 or not? And no, I don't. So this is the more difficult factoring. I'm going to take this number here, 6 times negative 20, and put my product right over here. If you do that correctly, you'll get a negative 120. Now, if I'm going to list out all the factors of negative 120, I better have a couple sheets of paper and a lot of time on my hands. And I'm not going to do that, okay? I'm going to use common sense and try to narrow it down until I find a group that kind of makes sense and would combine to a negative 7. So I know it wouldn't be 1 in 120 or 2 times 60 or 3 times 40 or 4 times 30. Let's see, 5 times 24, that's not going to work. 6 times 20 is not going to work. 8 times 15, we're getting closer. 8 times 15 would be 120. Actually, that would work. So let's write down those two numbers. 8, kind of stumbled across on accident there. But did you see how quickly I did that? It really doesn't take a lot of time as long as you just go through the factors of negative 120. 8 times 15, we want a negative 120, so it's a positive times a negative, and negative times a positive. Now, only one of those numbers combines to a negative 7x, and it's going to be this one right here. Okay? So, I'm going to rewrite this negative 7x with two terms. So, I'm going to bring down my 6x squared. Then I'm going to put positive 8x, and then negative 15x, and then minus 20. There we go. And now let's factor out what's common in the first two terms. What goes into 6 and 8 evenly? Well, a 2 does. And they both have an x. I can pull one x out. And so 2x times 3x would give me 6x squared. And 2x times 4 would give me 8x. Now let's look at our last two terms. Oh, look at this, students. Remember what I've taught you. Whenever this term right here is negative, you're going to, whatever you pull out or whatever you factor out of these last two terms, you are going to put a negative sign right there. Please don't forget that. Whenever this is a negative here, you will put a negative sign here, always. Now, what number or what's the largest factor that goes into 15 and 20? Well, 5 does. And then, do both of these terms have an x? No, they do not. So, I'm not going to pull an x out. Now, negative 5 times 3x. Let's see if that works. Negative 3, negative 5 times 3x is negative 15x. That's good. Now, let's see. How about a positive 4? Let's see if that works. A negative 5 times a positive 4 is a negative 20. So, yes, that works. And notice how your parentheses match. So, you write your matching parentheses, 3x plus 4 once, and then you're left over with 2x minus 5 in parentheses. Moving on to number 39. Number 39. Step 1 is always factor out the common factor. I have a 4, a 15, and a 9. No number goes into those numbers evenly. And notice every term does not have an x. And so I cannot factor out any common factors. So I notice my first term here has a lead coefficient of 4. I multiply that by 9. I put my product right over here. 4 times 9 is 36. So I put a positive 36. Now I could take time and list out all the multiples of 36. But the one I think that's going to work, seeing that I have a 15 right here, is a 3 and a 12 and a 3 and a 12. A positive times a positive and a negative times a negative. Now one of these adds up to 15. It's this one right here. So where the positive 15x is, I'm going to write a positive 3x and a positive 12x, okay? And then bring down your last term, positive 9, and bring down your first term, 4x squared, okay? Now, let's factor out what's common in the first two terms. There is no common factor for 4 and 3. However, there is an x in both of these terms, so I can factor out an x. And when I do that, I'm left with 4x right here, because x times 4x is 4x squared, and x times 3 is 3x. Now, let's look at your last two terms. What number goes into 12 and 9 evenly? Well, 3 does. And can I factor out an x? Well, no, there's no x with this term right here. So I can factor out a 3. So 3 times 4x, 3 times 4x would be 12x, and 3 times 3. 3 times 3 is 9. Notice your parentheses do match, so I'm going to write 4x plus 3, and then in my other parentheses I would write x plus 3. Pretty simple. Moving on to number 40. All right, step 1 is factor out what's common. Notice there's no number that goes into 2 and 7 and 6 evenly, and notice I do not have a y in every term, so there's nothing I can factor out. Next, I notice that I do not have a lead coefficient of 1, so I multiply 2 times 6, and the result of that product would be 12. Now I could list out all the factors of 12, but I'm going to save some time. I notice I want a group over here that's going to combine to positive 7. So right away I think of 3 times 4, 3 times 4. A positive times a positive, and a negative times a negative. Now only one of those adds up to positive 7, and it's this group right here. So where the 7y is, I'm now going to replace that with positive 3y, positive 4y. Then bring down your positive 6, and bring down your 2y squared. Now, let's look at our first two terms. I have a 2 and a 3 for their coefficients. There's no number that goes into 2 and 3 evenly. However, I can factor out, I have 2 y's here and 1 y here, so I can factor out 1 y. So I'm left over with, well, let's see, y times 2y is 2y squared, and y times 3 is 3y. Now, I have a 4 and a 6. The number, or the largest number that goes into 4 and 6 evenly would be 2. And notice I do not have a y in both terms, so I cannot factor out a y. 2 times 2y would give me 4y, and 2 times 3 would give me 6. Now, notice my parentheses do match, and that's good, they should. So I write my matching parentheses one time, 2y plus 3, and I'm left over with y plus 2, or y positive 2. Number 40. All right, let's move on now to number 41. That's the wrong button. I apologize. And there we go. Let's move on now to number 41. All right, at number 41, the first thing I notice is I have a 2. Don't forget there's a 1 here. I have a 2, a 1, and a negative 6. There's no number that goes into 2, 1, and 6 evenly, and I do not have a y in every term, so there's nothing I can factor out. Next, I notice my lead coefficient right here is not a 1, so I take my lead coefficient of 2, I multiply it by negative 6, and I put the product right over here, which is a negative 12. Now, I could list out all the factors of negative 12, but I know that whatever I come up with over here, I want it to combine to a positive 1, which is what's in the middle here. Okay? So right away, I think of 3 times 4. I think that's going to be a good fit, 3 times 4. Positive times a negative, and negative times a positive, because I want to have a negative 12. Well, only one of these two groups combines to a positive 1, and that would be this group right here. So where I have my positive y, I'm going to rewrite that with negative 3y, positive 4y, okay? And then bring down your negative 6 and bring down your 2y squared. Now look at your first two terms. No number goes into 2 and 3 evenly. However, I can factor out a y, so I pull out a y, and I'm left with 2y minus 3. I'm going a little faster now, but we have done tons of these, and you should be getting pretty good at this by now. Y times 2y, 2y squared, y times negative 3, negative 3y. Now I have a 4 and a 6. The largest number that goes into 4 and 6 evenly is 2. Notice I do not have a y in both of these terms, so I cannot pull out a y. 2 times 2y is 4y, and 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Notice your parentheses do match, which is always a good thing. And then your other parentheses you would be left over with y plus 2. Let's move on now to number 42. Number 42, finally, well actually there's nothing here. I thought there for a second that we could factor something common out, but we cannot. I have a 20, a 23, and a 6. There is no number that goes into those three numbers evenly, and I do not have a p in every term. So I cannot factor out any common factors. So next I notice that I have a lead coefficient of 20, and I multiply that by my 6, and I come out with the product over here. And my product would be a positive 120. Now, I could take time and list out all the factors of 120. Obviously that's going to take a while. I'm going to try to do some in my head and think of something that would come out to negative 23. And it's kind of funny. I was getting ready to reach over and pause the video and think about it, but I don't need to. It just hit me what it would be, because way back here on a previous problem when we had 120 right here, remember we used 8 and 15? Well, I think we're going to do the same thing here. Let's try it and see. 8 times 15, 8 times 15. Notice you want a positive 120, so a positive times a positive and a negative times a negative. And look at that. This group right here combines to negative 23, so not too bad. So where the negative 23p used to be, we're now going to write negative 8p and negative 15p. All right? And then bring down your positive 6 and bring down your 20p squared. Now look at your first two terms. What's the largest number that goes into 20 and 8? Well, 4 does. And I have 2 p's here and 1 p here, so I can factor out 1 p. So if I do that correctly, I would have a 5p here. Isn't that right? Let's see, 4p times 5p is 20p squared, so that's right. And over here I would have a negative 2. 4p times negative 2 would give me a negative 8p. Now remember, whenever this term right here is negative, that means you do want to put a negative sign right there. Okay? So I'm going to put a negative sign. And now, what's the largest number that goes into 15 and 6 evenly? Well, a 3. And there's not a p in both terms, so I cannot factor out a p. So that should be it. Negative 3 times 5p. Negative 3 times 5p is negative 15p. And negative 3 times positive 2 would be, actually that's incorrect. I need to watch my signs there. A negative 3 times a negative 2. Watch this carefully. A negative 3 times a negative 2 would give me a positive 6. You don't want a positive sign here because a negative 3 times a positive 2 would give you a negative 6, and that's not what you're looking for. All right, now notice my parentheses do match, so I'm going to go ahead and write 5p minus 2, and then I'm also going to write what's left over after I factor out 5p minus 2, and I'm left over with 4p minus 3. 4p minus 3. All right, moving on now to number 43. Well, students, as I look at 6, 29, and 28, I know right away there's nothing that goes into these numbers evenly. And how do I know that? Because 29 is a prime number. Nothing divides into 29 evenly except 1 and 29. I do not have an A in every term. There's no A here. And I do not have a B in every term. There's no B here. So I cannot factor out anything common. So next I notice that my lead coefficient is 6. It's not a 1. So I'm going to take this number here, 6, times 28, and put the product right over here. And I'm going to try to do this in my head. That would be what? 48, carrier 4, 12. I'm getting 168. I hope that's correct. So 6 times 28, carrier 4. Yeah, that's right, 168. So we've got a lot of factors to list out if we're going to list out all the factors of 168. And there's no way that we really need to do that. All right, so let's see. We could use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 would be 21. And I think that's it. Now, I did that. Let me explain to you how I did that so quickly in my head. I knew 1 times 168 is not going to work. I knew 2 times 84 is not going to work. I know that 3 times 56 is not going to work. I mean, there's no way those combinations are going to combine to negative 29. So I kept going through numbers, 4 times 42. And when I got to 8, I'm like, hold it. 8 times 21, 8 times 21. I think that's going to work. Now, I wasn't for sure, but I knew I had a pretty good chance. So I want a positive 168. So I want a positive times a positive and a negative times a negative. And look right here, this group combines to a negative 29. Now watch this carefully. Where the negative 29AB is, I'm going to write negative 8. Notice I put AB because this middle term is an AB term. So I put negative 8AB and negative 21AB. And then bring down your last term, 28AB, I mean B squared, excuse me, and then bring down your 6A squared. And now we're ready to roll. Look at your first two terms. What's the largest number that goes into 6 and 8 evenly? Well, that would be 2. And notice I do not have a b in both terms, but I do have at least one a. So 2a. Now, 2a times 3a would be 6a squared, and 2a times negative 4b. That's going to work. 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. A times b is ab. Now I look at my last two terms. Notice I've got a negative sign here, which means I've got to put a negative sign right here. Please don't forget that. That's one of the most common mistakes students make when doing this factoring by grouping. Okay, put your negative sign here. Now what's the largest number that goes into 21 and 28? Well, 7. I do not have an a in both terms, but I do have a b, so I can factor out a b. Now let's see what I'm left over with. Negative 7b times 3a. I think that'll work. Let's see. A negative 7 times a positive 3 is a negative 21, and b times a is ab. So far, so good. Now I want a negative 28, so I'm going to put a negative 4b. Now let's see if that works. What's negative 7 times negative 4? Positive 28. And what's b times b? B squared. Notice my parentheses do match, so I have 3a, excuse me, 3a minus 4b. And when I factor that out, I'm left over with 2a minus 7. 2a minus 7. All right? And that's number 43. And now let's take a look at number 44. 44. All right. There's nothing common you can pull out, numbers or variables. So I notice my lead coefficient is 10. So 10 times negative 12 is a negative 120. So I'm going to have to somehow find factors of negative 120 that combine up to a positive 7. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 is not going to work, 5, 6, 7. I think 8 and 15, it's kind of funny. We keep using those two numbers, but I think 8 and 15 is going to work again. Let's see. 8 times 15 is 120. I want a positive times a negative and a negative times a positive. And these two numbers right here do combine to positive 7. So where the positive 7 mn is, this term right here, I'm going to rewrite it with two different terms. Negative 8 mn, positive 15 mn. Bring down your last term, negative 12n squared. Bring down your first term, 10m squared. Okay? And now with that in mind, let's factor out what's common in the first two terms. What number goes into 10 and 8 evenly? Well, a 2 does. And notice I can pull an m out of both terms. Now, if I do that correctly, right here I would have a 5m, because 2m times 5m is 10m squared. And then over here I would have a negative 4n, because a positive times a negative is a negative 8, and m times n is mn. Now, let's look at our last two terms, a 15 and a 12. The largest number that goes into both of those would be a 3. I cannot pull an m out, but I can pull an n out. So I'm going to factor out 3n. Now, 3n times 5m. Let's see. 3 times 5 is 15. N times m is mn. And then negative 4n. Let's see. 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. N times n is n squared. And notice our parentheses do match. So 5m minus 4n. And I'm left over with, in the other parentheses, 2m plus 3n. So there we go. Only two problems left. Two more problems and we'll be doing well. So number 45 is next. All right, students, we look at number 45 here. I've got a 12, a 4, and a 16. I can finally factor something out first. I'm going to factor out a 4. Notice there's not an a in every term, so I cannot pull out an a. And let's see. Here I would have a 3a squared. 4 times 3 is 12, 12a squared. Here I would simply put a negative a, because 4 times negative a is negative 4a. And then over here a positive 4. No, that's incorrect. It would be a negative 4. 4 times negative 4 is negative 16. Now, students, do you notice that the trinomial I'm left over with does not have a lead coefficient of 1. It has a lead coefficient of 3. So I've got to take this 3, multiply by negative 4, and write my product right over here. So 3 times negative 4 is negative 12. And now, I could list out all the factors of negative 12, but instead, I'm just going to use some common sense and think this through. I know that I want a negative 1 here for my middle term. So, how about 3 times 4, 3 times 4? Positive times a negative, negative times a positive. This group right here would combine to a negative 1. So where this negative a is, and by the way, I'm not going to keep bringing this 4 down. I'm just going to wait until the very end. I'm going to go ahead and do it right now. I'm going to put it right down here so I don't forget. I'm going to bring that 4 down for my final answer, and now I can just forget about it. Okay, where this negative a is, I'm going to write 2 terms. I'm going to put a positive 3a and a negative 4a. And then bring down your negative 4, and then bring down your 3a squared. Now, what goes into 3 and 3 evenly? Well, 3 does, and I can pull 1a out, so I'm left with 3a times a is 3a squared, and 3a times 1 is 3a. Now, remember when we look at our last 2 terms, whenever this is negative, I want to always pull out a negative sign there, okay? So I'm going to put a negative. What goes into 4 and 4 evenly? Well, 4 does. I do not have an a in both terms, so I cannot put an a. And let's see what we're left over with. A negative 4 times a would be a negative 4a, and a negative 4 times 1. A negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Now, notice your parentheses do match. Good thing I brought this 4 down earlier so I didn't forget it. My matching parentheses, I write that once, a plus 1, and I'm left over with 3a minus 4. And this is your entire answer right there. And we're 1 problem away. So good job, we're almost finished. All right, let's take a look now at number 46. On number 46, I notice I have a 12, a 14, and a 20. And the largest number that goes into all of those, I think, would be a 2. Yes, it would be a 2. So I'm going to factor out a 2. And there's not an a in every term, so I cannot factor out an a. So I'm left with 6a squared minus 7a minus 10. If you took this 2 and multiplied it back through, you would get this right here. Now look at your leftover trinomial. Notice you do not have a lead coefficient of 1. I wish we did. It would be easier. But instead we have a lead coefficient of 6. So I take 6 times negative 10, and that would give me a negative 60. Now I could list out all the factors of negative 60, but instead I'm going to use common sense and try to think of one that would give me a negative 7. Let's see, 6 and 10, 5 and 12 is what I want, I believe. So 5 times 12, 5 times 12, positive times a negative, and a negative times a positive. Now one of these adds up to a negative 7, and it's this group right here. Now again, I'm going to take this 2 and bring it all the way down here in my final answer, and now I don't have to worry about it. Okay, where this negative 7a is, I'm going to rewrite that with a positive 5a and a negative 12a. Then I'm going to bring down my negative 10. Over here, I'm going to bring down my 6a squared. Now there's no number that goes into 6 and 5 evenly. However, I can pull an a out of both of those. So if I pull an a out, I'm left with 6a. A times 6a, 6a squared, plus 5. A times 5 is 5a. Now notice I have a negative sign here, so because of that, I'm going to have to put a negative sign here. And 2 goes into 12 and 10. 2 is the largest number that goes into 12 and 10. I cannot pull an a out because there's no a with your 10. Well, let's see. Negative 2 times 6a. Negative 2 times 6a is negative 12a. And negative 2 times positive 5 would be negative 10. And notice your parentheses do match. I already brought down my 2. So I'm going to write my matching parentheses once. And you're left over with a minus 2. A minus 2. All right. I hope this helped video. If your homework has been helpful, and work hard on your homework.